Okay, this hybrid meeting of the Policy Committee of the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library Board is being held pursuant to and in compliance with Albemarle County's ordinance to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 disaster. So welcome everyone and hello. Just a note, schedule-wise, this is actually our June meeting, which has been kind of pushed back because of all sorts of stuff going on, including some vacations and so forth. So I would expect the next policy committee meeting to be 2 months from June, which would be August and so forth. So I just don't want people to get confused that, oh, it's July, so we have 2 months until the next meeting, which sort of eat into that time. Technically also though, as David pointed out before the meeting, the policy committee, we're at sort of our yearly change of officers as a board, so this committee might be reconstituted in various ways, and so the next chair may have different ideas. So that's just what that's the working plan that I would hand over to whoever that is. Okay, so on our agenda today, we start with the policy 3.2 library equipment fund.
Would you like me to share that?
Yeah, please share it. And I know you had some kind of recommendations of where we are with that.
So this was discussed at the last meeting of the policy committee, and we left with the idea that we were going to review what this says in light of what the regional agreement says, which I have done. I've been looking at the regional agreement, and specifically the wording there says, the Board of Trustees will retain all fines and fees, excluding out-of-area library card fees, in a separate equipment fund to be used for maintenance, replacement, and purchase of equipment and purchase of books and other library materials. So that's the directive that cannot change within this policy, and this policy reflects that. We had kind of two things. One, is that going to change if there's a review of the regional agreement, which we're all expecting to happen this fall? I think that likely any discussion of the regional agreement would lead to a discussion of the equipment fund and what fines and fees are constituted as. So there might be better definition in the regional agreement moving forward. So part of my thinking is that we would put a pin in this until after that process and then revisit it and see if it still holds. The other discussion that this group has was whether or not we needed this at all. And we talked quite a bit about having something handy to show to the public to say, like, hey, here's how the funding of JMRL works, which is a good idea. And regardless of what the decision is, that needs to happen. But whether or not we would consider deprecating this policy altogether. So either put a pin in it or decide we don't need it at all, I think are my suggestions.
I mean, the third option I would throw on the table is you just use this to reference the regional agreement and say, the equipment fund is managed in a way as described in the regional agreement. I mean, I don't love that because now somebody from the public is having to go
two places.
Well, two places, but the other one is a more lengthy legal document. It's not really set out to be user friendly. Yeah, so I think that goes back to what that would do is that would future proof it, but we also have a sort of a communication goal here. So it sounds like we agree we want the public to be able to accessibly understand structurally how things are funded and organized. And we're going to do that, it sounds like, with an infographic sort of on an operational level. If we have that, then what are the remaining purposes of this? So I think put a pin in it. I would be happy to put a pin in it pending the existence of that infographic.
Yeah, I would even think maybe we could have some sort of combo, a policy here which is broader and incorporates all revenue streams, basically something about budgeting, the budgeting cycle that touches on everything, and then the infographic could be referenced as part of that, so that the equipment fund isn't sitting out as its own lonely thing, that have a broader policy that says, hey, here are the streams of revenue for JMRL. I mean, it does get into exactly what you're saying. Like, that's less of a board policy and more of a communication thing, trying to tell the public.
We don't have a policy in place for any of the other operational budget pieces.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
So this is an outlier anyway. I vote for, let's just, stick a pin in it and revisit it after any regional agreement, negotiations happen. And we can choose then to say, okay, well, it didn't really come up. It wasn't, it was not part of the negotiations. So, just turn it over again, because it's not as though it's in need of immediate revision. It's only because we're coming up on a sunset, right?
Correct. It said it's 10-year review period. It was last review. Well, oh, there we go. It said it's 20-year review period.
But Tony, I think we can sort of articulate what's the purpose of this. Is it mostly, the purposes in general of policies can be to communicate to the public important stuff about what they should expect about how the library operates. It can be governance level direction to staff. Hey, we want, this is, we want staff to do certain things certain ways, and we think it's important to write that down in advance. And you're correct that this is the only one that, as far as budget structure, that's sort of written down in this way. That's an interesting point. We have strong budget practices,
But they're not articulated.
no one said you have to do it that way.
It's just odd to me that this is a budget piece, which is in the policy manual. And I have a funny feeling that were we to dig back even further, we would find that, it crawled in somehow, and has never left, type of thing.
Tony, what would you think, or others, if we said we would move in the direction of just a broad, again, in the community, from the standpoint of communication to the public, library budgetary process or structure, and just some high level comments about how it's accomplished. So the trick is you don't want to be so prescriptive that you don't have flexibility to make changes, but you do want to communicate, hey, here's what we do. So it would be sort of like a,
and that's my problem with it, Mike, having it in the policy manual, is that it is a little bit more hidebound than anything else.
Yeah.
And that we've had to, over the past 2.5 years, we've had to move things around and pay for this out of that, which we never used to do. And
right.
Having this in the policy manual really, is something. I just think it's an anomaly. And again, as David points out, it's in the regional agreement anyway. And we're going to have to, negotiate that with the jurisdictions this fall. So I'm just in favor of putting a pin in it. Let's see what happens in the fall.
I think my thinking would be that if I agree, let's put a pin in it, see what happens with the review committee. But I could see a scenario on the other side of this where we would want to fundamentally change this policy just to be more of an explanatory, like, JMRL budgeting. And it would be a policy that says, here's our calendar for the year. Here's where to find the calendar for the year. Generally, JMRL relies on state aid for this type of things. And generally, we rely on the equipment fund for these types of things. And generally, we rely on local support for these types of things. And just have it kind of laid out there so that, if a bus hits our administrative team, somebody else would have the guidelines for what the board's desires are there.
Yeah, I could see that. Yes, definitely. Sounds
but not only a bus hit, not only a continuity type of thing. It's more of, I partly think of the employee manual is where do the employees go to learn details about what they need to know about their job. I kind of think the policy manual, in some sense, one of the functions it serves is where the public wants to kind of see some details about how the library operates if they're interested. It's communicating important things to the public as well.
Ginny says in chat, Ginny says it'd be nice to be able to point the public to this.
Yeah. All right, so let's include in your comment here, David, for the future policy committee, just replacing this with a high level overview. But I certainly agree with Tony that that needs to be broad enough where we don't have to get the board to revisit or change the.
Yeah, I think there are ways to do that. Because I was thinking about what Tony said. He said, well, all this information is in the regional agreement. And Tony, I don't think the regional agreement says in there that state aid, don't quote me on this, but I'm not sure that it says state aid will be used for materials. You know, I think it just says state aid will be used to serve the library or something like that. So I think it would be useful to write down what we all know after, you know, many, many years of doing this.
Yeah, and I agree with Ginny. It would be a great help to have this in one place that we could all refer to, because it comes up time and time again.
Yes.
And, you know, saying, yeah, here, I've just explained it to you, and here's a link to an infographic about it.
I agree. We get the question from the public when they want to know about something specific. You know, they want to know, well, why don't you have more copies of this book? And to try to explain, well, that comes from state aid, which is a function of this formula, and you know, all that is useful and it's good information to the public. But it would be useful to say, here, you can take a look and see the big picture.
Yeah.
Which is what we were talking about 2 months ago with an infographic. But
And I think we did have a volunteer for the infographic.
did we?
Did we?
Maybe. I have no recollection, but sure, yeah.
I thought we volunteered Jennifer.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I think Mike was indicating that Camille had volunteered.
Oh, okay.
That was my recollection. I could be wrong.
Oh, Camille.
All right. Well, David, maybe behind the scenes
We'll
you
work
can.
on that.
Come up with that. All right. So then moving on in our agenda. The next thing in our agenda is the suggestions and complaints policy. And we had, I think, come up with a pretty comfortable bullet list. And we're really just at a wordsmithing stage. For today, I'm thinking of moving this to the sort of the end of the meeting so that we can, because I don't want to get bogged down in the wordsmithing and then run out of time to kind of look at everything. So I'm thinking of moving it to the end. If we go over an hour and some people need to kind of drop out, that would be fine. Whoever's able to stay for an extra 20 minutes or so, if that's what it ends up taking. Can wordsmith it, and then we'll circulate it by email to make sure everyone's comfortable with a first reading at the July board meeting. Does that sound okay with everyone?
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah.
Okay. So we're gonna move on then and we'll come back to suggestions and complaints, and then we'll move on to library card eligibility.
So this is a first look for this committee at this policy.
Okay.
Well, there's a typo in number 3.
Issue.
That's probably the translation. Google's translating it from.
That's what it is. And also, I hate to bring this up, but don't we want to kind of wait on the regional agreement with this too regarding the out of area discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that's certainly something that JMRL will bring to that review committee as annually gets brought up there. I just don't know. I don't know if that would be on the chopping block or not.
I do like the idea again. If it is in the regional agreement and if it remains there, I like being able to communicate to the public what that policy is without them having to look at it. So,
so Chris's point is that there's a chance that
yeah,
will change.
no, I agree. Understood. And in fact, is it renewable every 3 years? Is that a regional agreement thing, or is that a more administrative? I'm looking at number 1, the second.
That's administrative. That's not in the regional agreement. But I think that follows the state best practices, what data they're looking for annual collection.
And then
Ginny brings up the point that this doesn't include the new teacher cards.
Yeah. Is that a form of institutional card or not really?
And virtual cards. I don't love this number 3 here. Institutional cards are not issued. I think it has served its purpose in the past to be able to point to that when there's a group that wants, for instance, if there was a daycare that was coming to the Scottsville Library that wanted to make a card for the daycare, we've been able to point to this and say no. But it's also kind of pigeonholed us a little bit from some other services, like the bookmobile has an extended lending card available for some places. We have teacher cards. Like we have some things that are close enough to this that I'm not sure we should have in policy that we don't do this. I think.
Right, I was gonna mention teacher cards because that's something since this was last updated and we don't address it anywhere here.
And Jenny brings up that the customer service committee is discussing institutional cards. So right now, Jenny, by policy, they're not allowed. So,
Right.
So I'd be interested in a change here.
I think you can just tentatively strike it. I mean, just because it doesn't say cards are not issued, doesn't mean that you can't choose not to issue it. It doesn't mean that you must issue institutional cards. I mean, it just gives you more flexibility.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is that there's going to need to be at least a bullet 3, if not a bullet 4, to deal with virtual cards, and that we, again, need to get the input of the customer service committee to talk about that before we can actually put it in the policy. That doesn't get to the out of area fee, which I think at the moment, we can't do anything about, and we may have it on the table in the fall when we do the negotiations. We'll have to see. I mean, in the meantime, it stands. It's one of those, it's not going away, unfortunately. I had a question in bullet 1, all residents of and or real property owners in. What's the distinction?
Sometimes we have somebody whose residence is in, Richmond, but they own property and they pay personal property tax in the service area, and they're eligible for a card. Like, for instance, if you owned a home at Wintergreen or Lake Anna on the Louisa side, you could come in and get a card at JMRL as a property owner, even though you don't necessarily reside there. Like you don't. John used to say, it's not where your head hits the pillow, but you're paying property tax there.
Great. Okay. Thank you, David.
I'm not so concerned about virtual cards because I don't think there's anything in this language that says you can't have virtual cards. Teacher card, which I think are the outlier here, that should be addressed, to say we offer them, or I don't know how much detail we want to get into.
Again, we're playing with the line of what do we communicate to the public versus what do we,
Right.
what boundaries are we setting? Because I could see something along the lines of, staff may initiate programs for other, a more broad description of a class of things that include teacher cards.
I guess my big thing about the teacher card is that this clause about the out of area fee does not apply. So it's not that it's a different type of card or different services or whatnot. It's this policy at a broad level is about who's eligible. And right now it says that these teachers who live out of area but teach in area are not eligible, but they are eligible.
Okay, so you need to specifically add them.
So I think even something like adding, with the exception of teacher cards or something like that in this line about OA, and maybe Tony's right, we need to come, maybe, as Krista said, we'll have to revisit that, but I don't know.
We turn teacher cards into a part 1A of this, like its own separate section describing the teacher card policy.
I mean, I think there could just be, a sentence here that says, I'm not sure what the language would be, but it would say something like educators that work, but
Educators may be eligible. Like,
Sorry, is there ever any discussion in the regional agreement discussion of point 1 and people who work in the service area being eligible for cards that would cover teacher cards? Like, do you think that would come up in this?
that discussion has happened, and I could see that as a
Yeah.
potential outcome. Like if you live in Flavanna but you work in Albemarle.
Yeah. Like, I have city workers who come in and repair the building but don't live in the service area, and then they're like, oh yeah, I want to get a card. I'm like, it's $30. Yeah, the library where I used to work, it was if you lived, worked, or went to school in the service area.
That would require a change in the regional agreement.
But was there, I'm remembering a Friends program to pay those or subsidize.
Yeah.
Is that still active?
It's active for the people who have a mailing address of Scottsville.
Right.
Oh, okay, it's not a. It's
Very
not a
specific. Scottsville was the hardest hit branch when the out of area fees went in, so
Yeah.
the Friends subsidize people who live outside of Albemarle County, but their mailing address says Scottsville.
okay, so that wouldn't cover Camille's.
I think the Friends would be open to some sort of arrangement to cover other cards. Go ahead, Ginny. Just gotta unmute though.
She seems to be on chat for.
So virtual cards are available to out of area people, right? They're
No,
only good for 90 days, but isn't that right? Because we don't check an ID.
well, we check the address. The address has to be within the service area.
Oh, we do. Okay, so they do have to give their address. Okay,
Yeah, you have to give an address and it has to be within the service area.
okay.
And then they need to come in and show an ID in order to pick up the card after 90 days or it goes away.
Still, it is a kind of extra service in a way that we offer. I kind of feel like it ought to be mentioned in here just because this is a public facing policy.
Yeah, I don't mind doing that. The one I'm concerned about is the teacher cards that currently, as this stands, are not. They're kind of in conflict with what our current.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that should definitely be in there because that's a major new service.
Draw wording from whatever procedure we have.
Yeah, we've got some, I think, some teacher card procedures. I was thinking something similar. We could go back and look at that.
Yeah, I'm sort of leaning towards if these are different kinds of cards with different parameters, put a couple of special bullet points explaining those. And then in this, where you are now, it would just be library will be issued for an annual fee of $30, other parentheses other than teacher cards. Or just shoehorn it into that one line, that it's an exception. It doesn't make sense to do that if you don't additionally explain what teacher cards are, but I think if you do that, then you can just put a much shorter reference.
So again, like this, keeping in mind that the focus of this policy is on who's eligible for a card. So I still don't, I hear what you're saying, Ginny, about virtual cards. But to me, the same people are eligible for virtual cards as physical cards. Teacher cards, there's an exception. Maybe we'll go looking for, per Camille's suggestion, the 2 procedures for customer service committee info to add about teacher cards. If we wanted to describe virtual cards, I think it would just be focusing on the eligibility. So it would be those details that you said, Ginny, about, like 90 days, then you come in and those types of things.
Right.
And I'm not, maybe that belongs here, maybe not.
Well, maybe it's more procedural then.
Yeah, that's kind of what my gut says.
Because it's the same eligibility.
So I think we could probably just take those ideas, knowing that there may potentially be a change, just potentially, to the out of area discussion that would be, we would have to reopen this anyway, but I think we can take what we've got here, right, and work on some stuff and have it ready for the August meeting or potential first reading in August. Doesn't seem too much work.
Okay, I have one other point on the very last paragraph.
Yeah.
There are no age requirements for obtaining a library card, which speaks to eligibility, as you pointed out. However, unfiltered internet access is granted on the base. That sounds like it's off topic to me. So if it's covered somewhere else, you strike this, just continue with, there's no age. You just keep it only about age. I mean, that's very specific service kind of related.
Yeah. That would be probably the computer use policy.
Pretty sure that's in there.
Shall we take a look? all adults based on library card registration, seeking unfiltered access. So it's specifically covered already.
Yeah, to me, then just, don't need it in two places, and this doesn't seem to be on point for what the scope is here.
So that would be just striking that.
That's a good point, Mike. I agree with that.
I mean, same with the rest of this paragraph, really. If the policy is about who's eligible for a card, this gets into other issues.
Well, is it covered somewhere else? Because I do think you want patrons to know this.
Well, I can check on that. We don't have to do that now. I know, fines and fees cover some of that. The question would be that question about fines and fees being the responsibility of a parent, whether or not that's covered elsewhere, I'm not sure.
There's also some gray area there because of how we're issuing cards to like the guardian of a child, even if it's sort of like a temporary guardianship, like say a child is living with their grandparent for the summer who lives here, and we issue a card to the child and grandparent signs for it so that they're responsible.
Yeah, I think that, we'd have to look into that. And I don't mind a little bit of gray area there because the alternative is saying no to the grandparent that brings their kid to the library.
Or somehow.
We're trying to get into somebody's family situation that we don't have any business.
I think
you
that's,
could just change it to guardian, the responsibility of the, oh, it says parents or guardian who signed for the card. I don't know. Maybe it's covered because it says or guardian.
that's a good point, though, to be eligible. So if a 9-year-old walks in the front door and says, I want a library card, it sounds to me like we have a procedure that there has to be a responsible, they're not actually eligible with that, or there's a condition. So it seems to me that condition should be stated here if we're talking about eligibility. So it would be something like there are no age requirements pertaining, however, minors under the age of X must be sponsored by a parent or guardian who will be responsible for materials.
Yeah, I could see that because that speaks to the eligibility.
Yeah, and then I would just take out the last sentence. I would leave the responsibility and then take that part out.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is not, it's not doing any work here. And it's mean.
I mean, I think it's covered somewhere else, if you don't.
I think it's probably covered in a third of the policy.
Okay.
All right, so you think we can workshop this and bring it back to the August meeting, hopefully with something that's ready to read.
Yeah, the main question open in my mind, but I know you're thinking about it, is just how much detail do we put in about this concept of teacher cards? I think you've made the case it has to be referenced at least as an exception to the out of area. So then you get into the business of having to explain what that is.
And I think a similar conversation likely will happen during any regional agreement review committee's discussion of out of area cards. Because I think we have a similar problem where that doesn't get addressed. It's not the regional agreement says, here's what happens if you're out of area, and it doesn't address this teacher night. Now I know from having talked to all the jurisdictions that everybody's on board with that idea.
Yeah, just gonna write it
It's going to need to be recodified there. So it might just be as simple as being able to, as you suggested, point this back, which would be an argument for let's put a pin on this until we have that discussion. But I feel like that's going to be every policy we look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, we could make a to-do list of policies to review after the regional agreement is renegotiated. But as David says, I think you're right. I think everything in there probably is in the regional agreement in some form or fashion. So.
Yeah, I mean, they all, well, those that have, sure, especially those that have to do with finances, they all stem from that.
Right, yeah.
Okay, this is good. I think this is a good spot here for this.
Great. Okay, then next on the list is Adult Programming and Reference Services Department.
So I did send this to Catherine Fay, who is JMRL's adult programming and reference services department manager, and she took a look at it to see whether or not there were any problems with the current wording, and then also I let her know that likely this committee would look at it and say, do we need this policy? Right. And that's, I think, the question before. She said, no, it's fine as is, but she also didn't feel strongly that this was a necessary policy.
Do you have a similar policy for other regional departments?
There
Yeah,
might,
that's what I was gonna check.
yeah.
Yeah, there's no sense if it's only for that.
So for circulation, we have that, the one we just looked at, confidentiality, fines and fees. So those aren't about the department itself. We have for services, interlibrary loan, we've got a programming thing. We've got bookmobile would be the closest thing probably. But there's no like children's services.
Yeah,
Young adult services policy saying here's why or saying from the board level, you have to have young adult services. Because I think it kind of, it goes without saying,
Yeah.
like, what are we doing here?
Those are at branch levels, is that correct? Usually, there's not a regional children's department.
There is, there's a regional coordinator of
Okay.
children's. It's mostly, for all of these positions, there's one person who's regionally responsible for efforts. Although the individual employees that are providing those services don't report to them, they report to their local branch managers.
Right.
So the only thing, David, if you could go back to policy for just a second. The only thing that I think makes a case for leaving this in the policy manual is somebody questions, how is adult programming designed? How do we come up with ideas for adult programming? Because we know in the past that there have been some objections occasionally to some of our, our programming, not very often. And if it's in the policy manual, we can say it's the function of, the.
Yeah, I can anticipate what Krista is itching to say.
I'm itching too, but let's Krista go.
Right, yeah.
Go ahead,
well,
Krista.
then just add young adult and children's to this, because why do we have it just for adult? Because we've had the same questions about young adult and children's policies also.
Right.
That's not what I thought you were
Yeah,
going
what
to
I
say.
was
What did you think I was gonna say,
We have
David?
a beautiful program.
Yeah, we already have
policy
a programs policy.
specifically to address exactly what he is talking about.
So Tony, this library programs is already in and was worked on by this committee
Remember that.
recently. God, there's so many pop-ups going on. I can't tell what's up. Revised December of 2018. So Krista, I hear your point being that if we're going to keep this, then we should just kind of do
I
the
just
same.
don't know why we just have it for this area
I
and
agree.
not for children's programming and children's services and young adult programming and young adult services.
I think.
I mean, is this policy about programming or is it about that department? I don't read it. I read it as this is about that department, which happens to be the adult programming and reference department.
I don't think that it's necessary.
I don't either.
Yeah, I'm leaning that way too.
I lean that way. My only goal that I could think of is more of a describing services that are available, making sure public knows about available services, which is something we talked about as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that has to be a policy.
I mean, the lifelong learning and
Yes.
promoting access is all in like the mission statement.
That was Kathy's point, right? She said this sounded
Right.
a lot like our mission and value.
Yeah.
Well, so again, as a patron walking in the door, I have a question about how many moons does Jupiter have? And there's a we offer a service that where an information specialist is going to help connect me with that. And I don't know necessarily when I walk in the door, if I've never come to the library before, how do I go and access that? So it would be more of a communication function.
Yeah, I hear you, but I guess my only concern there would be the lack of all the other,
Yeah,
which we've talked about for years, how best to,
right. How best to
to make these services publicly
accessible. Yeah.
accessible or discoverable.
Right. Yeah, and my preferred types of solutions for that in the past have not been, oh, we need more policies to describe it, but other types of publications for sure. So yeah, I think I would agree that we can deprecate this. But I'd like to keep that services conversation going.
Yeah.
Because I do think an organized and centralized directory type of publication, it's progress toward that for sure on the beta website. But this just reminds me of.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, that there's work to be done there. I don't think this is the place.
Yeah, I
for
agree.
that work.
I agree.
So can we potentially do a first reading in July to deprecate this?
Yes.
Somebody says yes.
Everybody
Bill
agree?
says yes.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
Jenny, Krista?
Yeah.
I got a complaint about the use of the word deprecate from a staff member because it's that's a more common parlance. That's like an IT thing, really.
Yeah.
You know, but before that, it meant something very different. Does everybody understand what we mean?
I mean, in the IT world, deprecate gets used on a daily basis to mean
Right.
the code is no longer valid. So
Okay, so this would go on the agenda, Tony, for the board to have a first reading of, do we want to get rid of this in 2 weeks?
And hopefully suggestions and complaints is going to get a first reading.
Yeah.
TBD in the next half hour here. Okay, so before we move to that, I wanted to put on the table for this committee or just mention, there was some discussion at the last board meeting about our public meetings policy. And David, maybe you want to pull that open when you're finished with your note.
Public comment?
Public comment. And is this something that David and I discussed this a little bit beforehand, and I agree with something David said. We don't want to make drastic changes midstream when we're kind of in a cycle with a lot of public comment, but also it's kind of come up. The thing that specifically came up was that I think was vague here. We had a bunch of folks who wanted to comment. I'm in favor of accommodating all of them in some fashion. The 5 minutes is set in stone here unless we were to change it. But then the point 3 here, if there are available public comment slots, the remaining slots may be filled. There's no statement right now about how many slots those are, what any sort of limit would be. If someone had said in that meeting, oh, we have 10 slots and that's what we're going to do today, I can imagine person number 11 in the audience saying, hey, I don't see where that's written down. So that's the main thing
That's probably why it's not written down, so that we're not held to a number. I don't know.
But then why would you talk about any concept of remaining slots? Yeah. So the question, I don't want to do work on this today, but I want to bring it to the committee. Is there interest in looking at this perhaps in August and starting a conversation? Today would just be introducing it to everyone's mind. And then we did get some feedback also about how the meeting itself is conducted and audience.
Right, signs and clicking your fingers and
all
yeah.
that. So again, I don't like changing rules in midstream, but it's valid. I think some meaningful feedback along those lines has been submitted. So do we want to open this up at some point, and what would be the timing, I guess, is my question.
we should have the policy on the agenda for probably the next meeting to revisit it. I would be in favor of just revising the policy rather than, deleting or adding anything to it. But I agree with Mike, and we need to at least take a look at it.
Okay, so the soonest timeline for that would be to discuss it in the August meeting, August policy committee meeting. And then I suppose if everyone was ready to recommend something, there could be a first reading in August of any potential changes at the board level. And then those could potentially go into effect in September.
Yeah.
Is that just considering this, trading that off against, we don't want people to feel like we've
Yeah, we're shutting
had
everybody off.
shut someone down or had a targeted reaction to something. Is there an argument for do what we just outlined, but push it back 2 months?
That's my
Yeah.
first instinct says that while we're having this very public discussion
Yeah.
about the name of the library, which has a lot of public interest.
Yeah.
That changing our own policies about how we're going to listen to people, even though what has happened is that people have identified holes in this policy, it doesn't exactly work. I think doing anything that would potentially limit that comments would be perceived as trying to shut
Yeah.
out public discourse.
Okay, so let's,
I think we could talk about it in August. I don't know if we'll be able to read it in August.
or you could say, well, we'll just start in 2 months later, start in October at the policy committee level, and then you would have another month or two of public meetings of experience to see what happened.
I mean, I think, and this is shut me down if this is too into the weeds about it, but I
Yeah.
think that the intention of the policy manual as it is to separate these public comments from a public hearing, which there's a separate policy for.
Yeah.
And it seems like the level of comment that we got at the board meeting in June was closer to what the policy manual intended to be a public hearing.
Right.
Rather than just straight public comment, but you can't, like, how is the board gonna be able to judge that
In
volume?
advance.
Yeah.
Right, because I think
Right.
a public hearing has to be arranged
It
in
has to be
advance.
noticed and it has to be, like, we're gonna have a meeting just to hear people talk about this subject.
Right.
Um,
And that doesn't seem to be it's not something I've heard, a proposal for, currently.
I mean, could there be something in here that says, like, if you reach a certain number of people interested in commenting, then like we'll arrange the schedule
We'll have
of
a
public hearing,
pre-register.
basically.
Yeah, I think it's the same issue that, if that were to happen in advance, great, but if you've got
Yeah.
20 people who show up to talk and after
Yeah.
person 15 say, no, I'm
Yeah.
gonna have another meeting in 2 weeks, then that's not really conducive to.
Okay, so we're going to open this up. Do we open it up for committee discussion in August or October? Would be the,
I think we can do, well, let's look at what else we have to do for the year. How about that? Okay, regional agreement will happen, outside of this group's hands, basically.
yes.
Library equipment fund, suggestions, card eligibility and reference, parking and vehicle use, we finished. Ethics policies has been hanging out there for a while. These other ones were not by schedule, so we're not tied to getting them done this calendar year. They were just things that stuff has come up in the last year or so that triggered for either myself or Mike that, oh, hey, we better look at that.
And I would like to get the reorg in this year. If we can pencil December for that.
Sure, we could have a pizza party.
And this is something that's been on the table for a couple of years, but just to describe what that means. It just means changing the headings of the categories and shifting around existing policies to kind of flow a little bit better. So for example, if you go, David, if you can go quickly to the website and go to the policy manual. There you go. So if you were to read this, the regional agreement is a long document in administrative services. Those are right up front. And I think the public is better served if those are in an appendix type of more of a reference material. It's sort of using the library stuff. What do the patrons need to know kind of up front to make it a little more user-friendly from that. And we had a kind of an outline of this started already. So if we can find it, because it is a couple of years old. But the point being that when we say reorg, we're not talking about popping open a bunch of policies and changing stuff. maybe some numbers would end up changing.
Yeah, I think some numbers would
Some
change.
numbers have changed.
And,
What is-
this discussion is what led to the employee handbook
Yeah,
working group,
Yes.
because we wanted to remove some things that weren't necessarily needed for the public to use the library
Yeah.
and put them someplace else.
but just sort of make sure everybody's on the same page of what the proposed scope of that would be. It's just sort of reordering things in a more natural flow so that it kind of is more useful for public stakeholders to be able to get what they need to get.
Yeah, Krista and Ginny and I will remember that the reason that it's ordered this way and the reason it has this numbering system is that there's a big binder that you probably still have at Gordon Avenue somewhere, where every month or every other month, the policy committee would send out to every branch, like, here's a new piece of paper, replace this one with that one, and that's how this, this schematic happened. But we have a lot more flexibility now, and it's a bit easier to rearrange than it was trying to get that manual in order. So, long-winded way of saying that I think that we could certainly add public comments. I think that there's time to do that, to look at it in August, and it wouldn't disrupt the rest of the work for the committee.
Okay, but then then we would be deciding, we might use discretion in the timing of bringing that to the full board.
Yeah, and I would think that the full board might want to have a little bit more input into that than they do with some of these policies, where they're like, yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for thinking about it and working on it, but this one will directly impact their meeting.
And that's what I told David this before the meeting, but this was discussed about 5 years ago when there was another topic with a bunch of public comment, and the committee changed it to 3 minutes and then brought it to the board, and board discussed and changed it back to 5 minutes. So there was, this is within the last 10 years that there was a very specific discussion.
Ginny says that it would make the public happy to have a little more transparency on public comments policy. So I agree with the general feeling that I lost it already, but that statement about, if there are slots available, needs to be quantified, like either by saying, try to hear everybody, but this amount of time, or we have this amount of slot, or whatever it might be. Some way so that the public has an expectation.
Right. Yeah, that's always the goal. Okay. So can you go back to that roadmap? So for next meeting, I think we have public comment. And then you can pick, I suppose the ethics policies might make sense since they are due. I think the point of the ethics policies we were holding those off for a reorg potentially.
I think the idea was that they were going to become appendices.
Yeah.
Like the original agreement or whatnot.
Well, let's put that on the list, because I think we're kind of obligated to by the schedule. And then if that's the outcome, then we can move it that way. And do we have time? Do we need to?
We're going to need to do feedback and complaints. We're going to want to. Oh no.
Well,
sorry,
hoping we
it's
can knock that
That's
out
what
now.
I'm
Yeah.
right.
I'm kind of sort of assuming that might be possible. All right, we'll see if there's one other. We'll see behind offline if there's one other that we can fit in for next time. Okay, so let's go on to the feedback and suggestions. So those are the bullet points right under the header that we had come up with, and I added a couple of other as I was thinking. So I made a very fast. The middle section is what's already there, I believe, and then the bottom section was a very fast pass at putting a 0 at the draft in place. I wouldn't call it a first draft.
Yeah, I think JMRL's managers need to talk about this, which might mess up our timeline here. Maybe not.
Which is fine.
It's just we need to. I get the feedback that managers deem is important for me to get. So Camille, if you get something that's a complaint about service or something like that, you'll send it my way. But I don't get every slip of paper that goes in there. Some of it is, thanks Camille for helping me do this or that. You know, I don't know what the line is, but there's a line there where staff will make a decision about whether or not this is something I need to see. So we would need to change, and I agree that it would be good to collect all of it so that we can notice these trends over time, so that if the complaint is that the elevator is broken at Northside, which it currently is, and that is every month or, you know, every September for 6 years or whatnot, we would have that baseline information. So we just need to procedurally think about that.
Yeah, that was, if you go back to the bullets, that was my recollection of the second to last bullet. That was the conversation last meeting.
And I just think we need to be clear here about what would constitute that type of feedback. So to me, it's the paper dropped in the box. We have specific like suggestion forms. Those get dropped in the box. And that's easy enough to say, hey, once a week, once a month, send me all of those. We'll collect them and then we'll enter them into the spreadsheet with the other email feedback, you know. Doesn't that sound fun? Somebody will do that.
Let's go.
But there's also just the line where somebody comes up to the staff and says, you know, I want, you know, you should know this, or why don't you, or those types of conversations, you know, like how that I'm concerned about not being able to capture that. So some of it makes its way to me if it's something that's on the staff's radar or they feel like needs to be addressed, or perhaps they need some support for. But a lot that happens every day where somebody has an idea or a thought or whatnot. Sure. So I think it would be more, and I'm just talking this through right now. I don't know that this is necessarily even a policy level thing. It would be more along the lines of how we handle reconsiderations, where it's if somebody comes to you as staff with some sort of feedback or suggestion, it would be to direct them to that, to listen to them and say, thank you for letting me know, whether it's a positive or a negative, and say, if you're interested, here's how you can officially submit that. That's what we do.
Judy has her hand raised.
Go ahead, Jenny. Oh, you just muted yourself.
I find that staff will comment to me sometimes, just like in an offhand way. You know, somebody said this the other day, and my reaction is, you know, I want you to tell me about stuff like that every time, right? Because sometimes it's important stuff and they don't seem to realize. I would love for there to be a direction that staff would just automatically, if someone makes a comment about our services, we just ask staff to routinely pop it into a box, just like your staff feedback thing, David, that you have on the web that you get. I would love to specifically direct staff to report this stuff, because I feel like we miss a lot because frontline staff don't report things that people say. And it is stuff that we want to know, and we don't ask for it very often. It's very rare that we do a survey for the public where we really get a lot of detailed information, but we act on that information if we have it. But if we don't have it, and it just doesn't travel upwards to the managers, I just believe that's true.
So Jenny, just so I'm clear on what you're saying that you would like the direction to be staff needs to then fill out some sort of form rather than the staff would suggest to the patron that they fill out some sort of form.
Well, often patrons don't really want to. They may not want to. They may, but they mostly don't. Like nobody ever uses our suggestion box. And I don't know how often you get suggestions on the web that come from green people, but I know that people say things at the desk all the time that rarely get reported to me. And I'm not on the desk very often because I have plenty of staffing in green. So I don't hear these things. And I would like my staff to be directed when someone makes a comment, positive or negative. I just feel like we should be, I know that on a busy desk, it might not always happen, but at least we could ask people. If someone gives us feedback on our services, I just feel like we should tell staff that they need to report it. It could be really quick. You just type it into a box and hit send. I would like to hear that stuff at my branch, and I know I don't always. always.
I'd like to hear it too. My concern as always is asking staff to make a judgment call on what constitutes. I think we would have to have better definitions than we have here.
Yeah, but we miss a lot of positive feedback. Nobody ever writes it down. If I get an email that's positive about our branch, I'm certainly going to send that to you. But a lot of stuff gets said at the desk that never gets reported because we don't ask people to.
Well, I'm thinking, Ginny, okay, you got 3 people lined up at the desk, and the first person in line says, I would like to make a comment that you folks need to be open more hours. Okay, you're not open enough hours. And the staffer says, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Okay. And then patron 2 has to come, and then patron 3 has to come. And by that time, the poor circ staffer has said, wait a minute, there was a comment there. What was it? Type of thing. But I agree with you. I think a formal mechanism can't hurt. Formal mechanism that's easy. You just hit the button and say, so-and-so said green should have more hours, click.
Yeah, it only takes a minute to write something like that on a Post-it note. And I think, there all the time people are saying, oh, staff don't have time to do this. They don't have time to do this. But really, staff do have time to do a lot of things that would be useful to us that we don't ask them to do.
Right.
And we don't find this stuff out. I'm convinced of that.
Camille?
Isn't there a form where we can staff can submit to you general comments?
Yeah, Ginny referenced that. There's a general staff feedback that can be anonymous even.
Right.
So I get stuff from that, but it's generally not from the public. It's not from the public having said something to staff. It's staff having their own ideas like, hey, green should be open more hours or things like that. I think my gut, Ginny, says that we would want to have something, a middle ground there is we make sure that we've already got the boxes at every location. We come up with some easy to point to, easy to use public form, and that when patrons bring that sort of feedback up, staff is trained to say to them, like with a reconsideration, to listen, to say, thank you for your feedback. If you'd like to submit that so that the library administration can see it, here, you can either fill out that form or you can go use the online one. I do have the same concerns that Tony does about trying to capture that data from staff.
Well, maybe we just have that form right at the desk and we train staff then to actually hand it to people, because it just doesn't, people just don't fill out that form very often. And I just think there's a lot of feedback that we're missing.
Yeah,
I do think you're biasing your sample when you say, when you provide it, someone already had this opinion and now you know it. Okay, I expressed it to you. Now you know it. You're going to lose some percentage when you say, well, now you got to go jump through another hoop for me to remember that, because you're putting the work on me, the patron. And the worst part of it is it's not a random. It's going to be biased towards the people who have the time and energy and the motivation, and maybe it's easy for them to do it on their front right now. You're not going to get a pure random sample of that.
I think we got in the weeds here. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
because the policy doesn't necessarily. This is my problem, right? Figure out how to make that happen.
Yes. Yeah. So, but where it started in your mind, I think, is you were looking at this and saying, well, hey, I'm being directed to do X, and we're all. And you're right. The goal of the committee today is what's the right level of requirement to put on you? Is it something?
So I think that
at a governance level, are we interested in telling you, hey, we think you need to kind of consolidate and see everything?
I'm interested, and I stated this last time we talked.
Yeah.
I am interested in that. I
Yeah.
want that
Yeah.
thing, and I think that any manager, any director that follows me will also want that.
Okay,
thing.
so it's just how is the right way to articulate it.
So saying, so this is not bad. It says do this thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell how.
Yeah, agreed that would be the goal at this level.
And I think what we can do is get Ginny, we could have at branch managers a lengthy discussion about like, hey, what would that look like, and how would we best capture that, and what would be the easiest way if we're going to ask staff to do it. Be something like we asked staff to do, in October and April, collect the reference stats, right? So that there are staff at the front level desk who have to make a decision based on definitions that we've given about whether or not that's a reference question. Now that's easy. They just put a check on a piece of paper. So can we come up with something that's that easy that just says, you know, we got feedback in these, it's in that category, you know? Camille.
I have another thought. This probably does not need to go in policy, but feeds in. Like in New Jersey, they have this thing they call Snapshot Day, where they collect statistics all day and they collect comments all day and they take pictures all day. Would like a periodic snapshot of qualitative comments be more
That's how
useful or easier to collect than just a constant ongoing sort of?
That's how the reference works, right?
Right, with the numbers, yeah, but I'm thinking like, you know, on that day, you have a 1-question survey that you put out to people that's literally just like, hey, you have any suggestions for the library to prompt input?
I think that that could prompt input. I think that that would not do what this policy that we're discussing is asking us to do.
I mean, like, I think the other thing to bring to branch managers is like, how specific, like, what do you actually want to know? Like, do you want to know that somebody came up to me and told me like a staff member was talking too loudly when I already then spoke to that staff member and we were like, hey, yeah, we both need to be quieter? Or like, do you want to know that because you want to know that like that happened in Northside too and you need to tell everybody again to stop talking so loudly?
Yeah, and I think what Mike's draft here says is that I'm going to get all of it.
Right.
So that I would know that not only is Camille talking too loud, but also, you know, whoever else.
Yeah. Is that useful? Or is that like too much information?
I mean, I think sometimes it wouldn't be useful. It would just be a matter of, you know, hey, Camille, keep it down. And sometimes it would be like, oh, wait, I've gotten 10 of these from Gordon Avenue about different people. Like there's something about the acoustics or about the staff or about the physical layout or about, you know, something that we can address.
I think the key on the back end would be to have flags and categories, you know,
Yeah.
this is branch level, this is, you know, regional.
So similar to, we asked staff to fill out incident reports, and that doesn't happen, as Tony described, like on the fly. They have to wait and do it. If something happens that I need to know about, they'll wait and do it later because it's time intensive. But it has a bunch of categories, you know, that say it was this, it was defacing library property, it was that. Krista, I'm sorry, I skipped over. You had a comment about the door.
That was just kind of a joke, but I mean, he gave us some feedback as he went out the door. I mean, you know, do we want that kind of feedback if we're recording?
No, I don't
everything?
think that was official feedback.
As he broke the door.
Door at Central, yeah.
Line between feedback and incident report.
Yeah, exactly.
That one's coming out soon.
Okay, so I think for the purposes of the policy committee, though, we can look at this wording and then there's a whole can of worms for staff to figure out what the best way to do this.
Mhm.
But is there anybody on the committee who feels like we shouldn't be attempting to capture that sort of feedback in a better way than we're doing now?
If it's realistic to do, I think it's good.
Well, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind is that, you know, we can't, I don't want to set up some system that we're not, it's going to fail. So.
Right. I hear what Ginny is saying, and some days it would be very doable, but I also can imagine at Gordon Avenue and Northside, there are days when you're adding one more thing to the staff person who already, or the branch manager who already feels like they're short-staffed and don't have enough time. And they're going to say, no, this is, you know, I can't manage this. So that's a discussion we have to have as as branch managers.
Okay, is that fair enough, Mike?
Sure. I mean, yeah, to me, I take the point about real world constraints. If you're saying, hey, we want to try and do this on a best efforts basis, you're going to get more of it than if you don't.
Yeah, I think that's where we'll
make that
land.
request.
Yeah.
So
I think we could probably the medium, the landing point is probably somewhere along the lines of, like Jenny suggested, we make the suggestions more visible, we make that more a part of what we offer to people, and then we also have some sort of staff mechanism for, as they can, they also can bolster that, can contribute to it.
okay. All right. So it sounds like, so wording wise, just since we've been talking about this, is the blue highlighted sentence say what we want it to say, given everything you've.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point here. I'm assuming you added that
Yeah,
while you were talking about it,
yes.
Mike. But we have always run under the, if it's anonymous, it
Yeah, of
doesn't
course.
apply, which is, the way it is. Do we need to spell that out here?
So in the original wording, if you can scroll up just a little bit, it said the comments will be analyzed and addressed by. So if I were just reading that, does addressed by mean I get a reply, or just maybe you do something and maybe you don't based on your judgment? That's what brought it to my mind, is like, hey, what should I expect again when I send you this suggestion? What should I expect will happen next? And I'm not saying I necessarily feel strongly that we need to say that every suggestion gets a reply. Might not be a bad practice, but I don't know if we need to commit to that, but it's probably useful to set an expectation one way or another. You're right that obviously something that's anonymous can't be replied to.
I mean, the wording and addressed is still in there.
Yeah.
So if you take the suggestions or the feedback that we've gotten since the May board meeting about the name change, I've received, triple digits in emails that have come in about this, and I responded to each one of those people who emailed library director or Deep Plunkett, just to tell them, I've gotten this, to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
When we set up a form on the website that it's like, collect this, send in your thoughts on it, I haven't responded to each individual person there. Some of them have not left responding information, which is one of the reasons. But also, I think that there's a different expectation there. If you're sending me an email, I think it's the right thing to do to respond to you. If you're filling out this form, we're asking, what do you think about this topic? I don't think it's necessarily.
Well, if it's a form, you can get an automated reply also.
We could do that, yeah.
All right, but
I think we can leave it as and addressed by.
Okay. Okay, and then moving backwards into the first section, we said we want to continue to have physical boxes. So that last time, digital, and of course we want to have digital submissions. Do we want to spell out what those methods are? Right now, if I go to the beta website, there actually is a feedback button, but it's very specific about the website, which is not actually obvious by the placement of that button. I think it's good for the kind of the launch phase, but in the future, in a longer term, I would probably, if I were just looking at that, I would probably expect that to be general feedback, not website specific. So do we want to, probably to me, that's, and then there's a contact us, which would be the other way I would go about it if I were, but that's also just kind of very general. So do you think operationally you want to make a dedicated web form feedback? And if so, do we put it into this policy? Again, we're in a communications purpose here. Do we tell people, hey, here's it? I think we want to tell people we're pointing out, yes, we want your feedback, and here's how you do it. So what can we say now about here's how you do it?
My gut says to leave it with wording similar to this, like go to our webpage and find the form.
Yeah.
Just because it's one more thing that, like, as we transition to the new website, that you'd have to go back and change the link every time.
Yeah.
We could have something generic like jmrl.org/feedback. It would always point to that form.
Or just an email, but yeah.
I think that's good enough. So here's what we've learned in the last few months where we've gotten a lot of public submissions. Initially, they, because if you look at the current Classic website, if you go to the contact page, it's got email forms that you can contact like every individual. You can contact Camille, you can contact me, you can contact Krista, depending on which one you choose. So we were getting feedback all over the place, right? And then something got indexed on beta, which is a much cleaner interface.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, all the emails started to come in on beta instead of on jmrl.org. Google found it. So what people are doing is not going to our policy. They're going to Google,
right,
to be like, how do I contact the library? How do I let them know? about this. So I think leaving it saying that we're going to have an option on the website and then just making sure that we make that available and as public as possible.
And then the last bullet on the bullet points, maybe some level setting. I did not remember what that means. I think it might mean what stuff gets consolidated regionally. I don't know if it's connected to the previous bullet or not.
So that would go back to where we started this conversation, which is like Camille asking, like, do I want to know if somebody's like, hey, there's trash on the floor of the
Yeah,
bathroom?
what's the threshold for? Okay, so that doesn't need to be spelled out in the policy. That sounds like procedure to me.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, so
You think that's ready for a reading?
well, you would take out the brackets on the first. And then that's the best I could do in 15 minutes. I mean, there was a lot of work. There was a lot of prep with the bullets that we'd already talked about.
And there's no pressure to get this read
Yeah.
in this month's meeting. I think this has been a very good conversation about what we want to do regionally and how we want to collect information from the public.
So I'm open to any next step here. People could take it back and play with the wording some more or have that opportunity, or we could say we're done and we're not gonna be able to do any better than this. Anywhere.
I'd be in favor of holding it over for at least till August.
Well, and we want the branch managers to have a chance to see it, talk
Yeah,
about it again,
Exactly,
right?
Right. Good
Okay.
point.
All right, so let's put these, maybe David, clean up some of the extraneous bullets at the top.
Yeah.
Rework it so this is clearly the new current draft. You'll take it to managers and we'll talk about it at the next policy committee meeting with that feedback.
So we won't have it on the board agenda meeting for July. You can talk about this conversation, but it won't be there for a reading.
I think that's correct. I think that's how I interpreted what Tony was saying. And also because that only would give you 10 days to get back with the managers and so forth.
And to be honest, so that would be via email because the managers don't have meetings in the summer.
I see.
But again, a lot of that stuff is procedural. So I think the managers can review the overall policy and I can say, we're going to have a bigger conversation about how to best implement this.
Let's put it on our policy committee August schedule.
Sounds good.
We'll hear your comments based on a little more thought. I mean, I think there is some interest in just how are you going to operationally, do this. We'll hear what you've thought about in the meantime and what the managers have to say. And then perhaps there will be no further edits, but give it one more opportunity. Okay, I think we are done with today's meeting then. If there's no other items, comments, questions.
We're good.
All right, thank you, everyone. And again, reminder, at least the default plan would be the next meeting of this committee is an hour before the board August board meeting. Great, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.